Hello everybody, and thank you for coming. Okay, let's find the ideal. Now? Fine?
It's perfect.
So it's a great honor to be here at the first conference on the Media Pluralism Initiative, and if I'm not mistaken, the first conference on the European initiative in general. So it's a historical moment, I think. I'm really touched to give a talk on the state of democracy in Europe. I was asked to focus on aspects of Euroscepticism and populism. And I will talk to you about national parties and European integration. You have heard already from Professor Rose what the problems are in the way the European Union functions. And I will define the concepts of Euroscepticism and populism. And then I will present you a comparative picture focusing on Western Europe. I didn't have data for Eastern Europe, where I will show you some research findings of my work on radical left parties and radical right parties and how congruent they are with their supporters, as well as the average voter. And then I will show you some findings about immigration issues and how party systems and voter match or don't match on these issues. And also I will show you another figure which is about the left authoritarians. I will explain what these people are. And finally conclude with what the European Citizen Initiative means in this context. So to begin with, how have national parties behaved in the process of European integration? We, political scientists, had expected that because the environment of political parties, the environment in which they operate, was constantly changing. There were constant policy transfers to the European level. So we were expecting them to change as well, accordingly, to change their organizations in order to adapt their structure and develop expertise and coordination with similar countries in other countries. Because there were a lot more actors, it was much more difficult to unilaterally affect the policy direction. And there was interdependence. And we were also expecting European integration to impact the party competition and the way parties behave in elections, the rhetoric about Europe. Well, after some research, we found out that not much had changed. There was no or very little change in terms of organization. And in fact, European integration and European policies were completely absent from national elections, but also from European Parliament elections. There were the issues that had been transferred to Europe were depoliticized from national elections, but they were not repoliticized in European elections. The classic argument is that people do not really care about Europe. Brussels is so far. But do people know about Europe? Who is responsible for shaping the agenda? Who puts the important issues in the agenda of competition? And do people have the education to understand the EU system? I mean, when we're in primary school, we learn about the national constitution and how the system functions, but we learn about Europe, I think nobody does. So, and that is very important for voters. And there is also the media who influence the discourse. Before the crisis, there was no real attention to what was happening in other countries. It changed with the crisis, but all those years, and you know, the European Union is almost half a century old, there was no real discourse about other countries, about Europe. So the only reference to Europe came from the so-called Eurosceptics. Euroscepticism is not a bad thing. It's a healthy critique towards the system. We should always be critical and try to improve the system, especially if it's a democracy, because democracy is an ongoing project. And there are degrees of Euroscepticism. There is a hard Euroscepticism, which rejects the entire construction of Europe and its policies, but there is also soft Euroscepticism. It is in favor of the project, but maybe it's against some specific aspects of the structure or the policies. So the mainstream parties have been, as I said, they have not really referred to Europe, but in general they have been mainly pro-European integration. So the opposition to Europe came from the extreme left. and from the extreme right, but for completely different reasons. The extreme left opposed Europe, or was skeptical towards Europe because of the single market, the opening of the market, and the neoliberal principles that were guiding the process. And these are fundamentally against the goals of the radical left. The extreme right, on the other hand, was very skeptical because of issues of national sovereignty and perceived the opening of the borders as a threat to culture and to identity. So these were the two poles that were expressing some kind of they were raising the issue of Europe, and it was against Europe. Now, Euroscepticism can become dangerous when it connects to populism. What is populism? Populism is a thin ideology that presents two entities in the political world. There is the pure people and the corrupt elites. And it understands politics as driven by the general will of the people and focuses on popular sovereignty. Populist discourse is used mainly by the radical right parties, but also by some on the radical left pole. It is a simplistic view of democracy, where people are understood as an entity, as a homogeneous entity. So pluralism is an enemy for populists. The social diversity and perhaps differences within society in terms of class and gender are completely irrelevant. Now, I was wondering whether the parties that use populist discourse and are on the extremes of the political spectrum are congruent with the average voter, but also with their supporters. And why so? Because there's an argument in the literature that when people support these extreme parties, they are protesting against the government. So if they are protesting, they're not really expressing a view, but they just want to slap the government for its performance. So were they congruent? We looked at three ideological dimensions. We looked at socio-cultural issues. These are issues of liberalism in terms of rights, for example, gay rights, immigrants' rights, more immigration, integration of immigrants, whether children should learn to obey authority, and so on. And then there's the socio-economic dimension, which has to do with the intervention of the state, so in terms of economic liberalism. And then there's the European dimension, the pro-anti-European integration, like the previous slides that you saw. So what did we find? We found that these parties were not really that congruent with the average voter in the electorate, but most of them were very congruent with their supporters. Especially the radical right parties were very congruent with their supporters on socio-cultural issues. We were expecting the radical left to be very congruent with their supporters on the socio-economic issues, but this was not really the case. They were very congruent with their supporters on the issue of European integration. So Euroscepticism was very well expressed by radical left parties, whereas these anxieties and fears about immigrants were expressed better by radical right parties. Moreover, in general, radical right parties were scoring much better in terms of the match with their supporters compared to the left ones. This is important because the radical right parties are very successful, whereas the radical left parties are either in decline or in mutation. They're trying to find their way after 1989. The effects of this is that the agenda has now focused a lot on immigration, and there has been a shift towards the right in the political systems. In another project, we looked at how the party systems and the voters whether they are reflecting each other, whether they are mirroring each other on the issue of more or less immigration. Now, what do we see in this graph? The bars are the respondents of the survey, so the voters. So this is the distribution of the voters' opinion. The red line is the median, and the bubbles are the parties, and some are bigger because they have more votes. It's the vote share that makes them big or small. So we see that there is not really a match, that their parties are trying to find the voters in this is a snapshot picture, and political party systems are dynamic, and then they're trying to find each other on the way. But what we see is, first, that there is no match in general, and second, that there are some liberal positions, like pro-immigration positions, that cannot be expressed. There are no parties to express positive opinions on immigrations in several countries. And in some countries, there is a bias towards the right. And this is against the common wisdom that says that electorates are very against immigration. What we found is that electorates are rather moderate on the immigration issue. This is European social survey data. You see Greece, that will be presented later. That is rather, the electorate is rather to the right on the issue of immigration. Now I want to present you another interesting, I think, graph. Now we have mapped voters, only voters, on two dimensions. The horizontal dimension is the socioeconomic left. So here is 0 is state intervention, and here is 10, very liberal, very open market. And the vertical dimension is the socio-cultural. So 0 is very liberal in terms of cultural issues, and 10 is what we call in the literature more authoritarian. So there is this quadrant in every graph. In Western Europe, you see there is a quadrant which we call left authoritarians. These are the people that are left on the socioeconomic axis. They want more state, but they are right on the sociocultural axis. By the way, we have another graph, but I don't need to show it to you because there are no parties. This is 2009 data. There are no parties in that specific quadrant. So you see, there's quite a lot of people in Greece, 36%, with that combines this type of opinions. And at that time, there were no parties. Sophia will explain to you what happened afterwards. But there was a demand. And it's widespread. These people are everywhere in Western Europe. We also tried to look how they vote because there were no parties. So we were trying to understand, okay, if they really want to find a congruent party in terms of policy positions, and there is no party, how do they vote? And we found out that when they considered the economy very important, they were worried about the economy, they tend to vote for left parties. Whereas when they are more worried about immigration, the same type of voters are likely to vote for the right. So this was before the crisis, before the really the zenith of the crisis. And what happened with the crisis? Although there was a tendency to have more integration on the EU level, on the national level, we had a lot more nationalist discourse, and about sovereignty and a very defensive perception of national interests. And there was a lot more fear of direct democratic procedures and how to involve the people. Remember when Greek Prime Minister Papandreou said that he has to ask the Greek people with a referendum whether they would sign up for it, and the markets went crazy, European partners went crazy, and then everybody thought that he was talking nonsense. So there is an anti-EU populist discourse. So there are parties that can express this, but there are no parties at the moment that express the opposite. People that believe that Europe is a good thing, but they don't like what they have now, and they think that Europe is a policy level that you can work with, but they would like to change the direction. So in this context, I think the European Citizen Initiative is a hope, although it's a small hope. Why is it a small hope? Because it is based on a very weak concept of participatory democracy. It does not lead to a referendum. It does not go for vote. It's just a proposal to the Commission, and the Commission is not bound to act. So all this work that you are doing might be in vain. You need to collect 1 million signatures from 7 different member states, and then the Commission might find a nice argument to dismiss you, which is very problematic. You want to involve the citizens, but then you're very careful how you involve them. And my question is, who really gets involved when it's so difficult and it's so uncertain whether you will have a result? There is also an integration bias in the European Citizen Initiative. You cannot change the treaty, you can only work with implementing the provisions of the treaties. But nevertheless, I think it is a chance to show, despite the difficulties, that citizens that believe that Europe can be a framework for action, that propose and try to mobilize to show that it's not only against Europe, it can be for a different Europe. And that transnationally, when there is power, then there's a lot of people supporting an initiative. I think that this is already, like the water initiative has been very successful. There's almost 2 million people have signed it, and the Commission has changed its legislation. It took out the water from the privatization list. So I think that despite all the hurdles, it is a hope of involving citizens, and maybe if it works well, the whole procedure might change and it might lead to a more binding initiative. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Zoe. I just have in mind that I think many Hungarians have very similar problems, that they do not have their own party, so it was very exciting to learn this problem also exists in Greece. Now that's a minor comment. Certainly your exposé was much more broader, and thank you very much for explaining us Euroscepticism and also talking about the problems of our initiative. I think we are going to talk more about the European Citizens Initiative in the afternoon, so I'm not going to react at all now, but there will be plenty of time to do so later on in the afternoon.
So a question to Zoe. You had two fascinating findings. One was that the combination between anti-immigration and pro-state intervention views are not well represented by party politics. And the other one, that actually the pro-immigration attitudes are also not well served by the parties. Would you agree that the two phenomena have different explanations? Perhaps the first one is because elites traditionally package issues differently than masses. In Europe, what we have is that traditionally, again, you have the pro-integration views coupled with pro-government intervention views on the left and the opposite on the right. So this is the way how the elite approaches, and this could be indeed very different from how the masses think about that, although the numbers that you had are really surprisingly large. But the other issue, why the pro-immigration views are not represented, maybe because parties leave the representation of those views to the government. That is, the government bureaucracy, the status quo is pro-immigration in the sense that they don't limit immigration particularly much in the framework of globalization. And because that is what's happening, parties in the competition, they don't need to stand up for the status quo. What they stand up is a various modification of the status quo, typically to restrict immigration.
I agree with you that the elites and masses have a completely different way of packaging these issues. And in fact, this combination, I mean, in a way, we don't want a lot of parties to have the same package because this is welfare chauvinism. But this explains also like what was the political space that parties like Golden Dawn tried to get. And I think that precisely, as you said, that they leave it to the government, but I think that the immigration issue is something that has to be politicized, and it has to be and framed also in human rights terms. So failing to do this, I think, results in fear and perhaps a populist discourse about immigrants as threats. So I think that the failure of parties to somehow normalize immigration as a topic has only negative consequences. Thank you. It was brief.
It was very brief. Thank you very much. Very short question, Georgie. Okay, we have maybe 1 or 2 more minutes. To whom? Please, Ildiko, yeah.
I would like to ask Zoe whether she really thinks that the first European this initiative, citizens' initiative regarding the water ownership is something to be very happy about, because for me this represents a tendency towards nationalism, what you were showing us in your talk, because it means, for me, it means that people want to take back the ownership of the waterworks to national hands. They are afraid of foreign owners. And in fact, what the Commission did by accepting this initiative is to track back and give way and let away a part of the single market. So in fact, for me, this is fear of the Commission from the Council, from the governments, who are tending also to give way, let free this growing nationalism. This is a backtrack for me in the European integration and not going forward. So this, for me, we are going to talk about the median initiative later on, but for me, this initiative is much more forward-looking, because this is something that aims legislation at the European level. The other one, the water thing, is just the opposite.
Yes, thank you very much. That's a very good point. I think that they didn't really take out water from privatization completely, but what they want is that some part of the water resources stays in the state's hands. It has been shown in countries like in African countries where companies bought the natural resources of water, and then it was impossible for the people to buy their own water, and you have seen the consequences because of the degree of poverty. Then if you don't have water, and water is, I think, something that cannot be thrown into the competition like other services and products, because it is vital for survival. So I don't see it so much as like going back to nationalist thinking. I see it more as protection of the population in terms of emergency, because we are having also now the poverty rising across Europe. So there is more and more people that might not be able to have access to water if water is only private. I think that's how I understand it, but it's a new dimension that you gave me to this initiative. And I think that no matter the topic, I think the fact that there was so much involvement for an initiative already so early, this was also a positive sign for the future of the initiative as an instrument. That's why I was enthusiastic about it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. In the afternoon we will defend our own initiative in more details. So thank you for both panelists for your contributions and for